You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
3CR is about community, and we welcome your participation at the station.
3CR is open to a wide diversity of volunteers and is a great way to connect with Melbourne's activist community.
Have you ever thought about volunteering, doing a reception shift, getting a program on air?
Training in radio skills or contributing to one of the station's committees.
There are many ways to be involved at 3CR.
To find out more, go to 3cr.org.au and get in touch.
That plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction, in the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano. I'm hosting this program with studios of 3CR in Melbourne. That's right, 3CR in Melbourne. And thanks once again to all those people in the Community Radio Network who make this program available to people across Australia via the Community Radio Network. And yes, it's good to be able to speak to so many people out there and hopefully get you thinking about different issues. It's not about changing people's minds, it's about giving a rational anti-authoritarian explanation of what's happening in the world today. Sometimes we're rational, sometimes we're irrational, but we do the best we can, as all of us do in life, whether we're parents, grandparents, if our workmates, whatever. We do the best we can. Sometimes we fail, sometimes we succeed, but we muddle through life. Now, you wonder what anarchy is all about? Anarchos, without rulers. It's a society without rulers. Not without rules, it means without rulers. What gives rulers the abilities to, stomp around and, bomb people to bits and claim it's all in the for the sovereign nation state? Well, it's inequalities in power and wealth. So the anarchist struggle is the struggle to devolve power, possibly through direct democratic means, and the struggle to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. Very, very simple concepts. Now, if for some reason, whether it's nature calling or your house burning down and you don't hear the whole program, don't despair. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. And if you like the podcast, let your friends know about it. There's hundreds of podcasts of the Anarchist World This Week looking at the issues of the week. Well, what I consider to be the issues of the week, you may consider another issue is important. Now, I didn't get an invitation. I'm distraught. I'm crying. I've got, I've been shredding my clothes, putting charcoal on my face. I'm in mourning. Now, Murdoch's Australia's only national newspaper, had a 60-year birthday party last week. That's right. That piece of trash, The Australian, was celebrating its 60th anniversary. That plague-ridden piece of junk was celebrating, and some of the greatest and the infamous were there to celebrate Murdoch's little baby, The Australian. Now, I know the Australian loves to dish it out, especially to the ABC, the poor old auntie, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. And poor old auntie crosses its legs and puts its head down and, loves to be lashed by Murdoch's The Australian. But The Australian, in my opinion, is the most damaging piece of garbage that we've had the displeasure of dealing with over the last 60 years. Let's forget about the fact that it is commercially should have been put in receivership years ago because it's never made a profit. Let's forget about that because it's not about making a profit. Murdoch established The Australian to be able to change the political direction of this country, to create a culture that promoted the neoliberal agenda in this country. That has been extraordinarily successful in shaping the political, social and cultural fabric of Australia, but not in the way that you and I would consider to be progressive or forward-thinking, but in terms of dragging us back into the dark ages in this country. It has done more to increase inequality in this country, to increase hatred in this country, to increase division in this country than any other news outlet has ever achieved. So they may be celebrating their 60th anniversary on this soil, but the reality is the damage that has been inflicted on this country by the Australian, which channels Mr. Murdoch's warped ideas into the political fabric of Australia, has been extraordinarily successful. Their privatisation, deregulation, globalisation, corporatisation message has now been incorporated into the DNA of this country's major political parties. And every day we see the consequences of them being successful in colonising this country's major political organisations into nothing more than an extension of the Murdoch Empire's monetary ambitions. At the same time, culturally, it has been responsible for creating some of the most extreme and divisive concepts in this country. As far as its attitude to climate emergency is concerned, there is no climate emergency as far as they're concerned. And it's all, it's all about forward with the fossil fuel industry. When it comes to reconciliation with this country's First Nations people, all we get is a pile-on this country's First Nations people. When it comes to this country's trade unions, all we see is a constant litany of lies, half-truths regarding trade unionism in this country. Now, I don't give a shit what they talk about, what they write about, what their political and cultural agenda is, but I am very, very exceptionally concerned at the way their viewpoints, their anti life viewpoints have now inculcated this country's thinking, not just in terms of institutional structures, but in terms of the ideas which have become commonplace in this country as a result of an editorial agenda which has been promoted by this Murdoch piece of, how shall I put it, I won't compare them with garbage because garbage is useful, you can recycle it. It is just an extraordinary situation we find ourselves in 2024 when we see the damage that has been caused nationally. A damage which has increased divisions in this, damage which has created and expanded divisions in this country, damage which has placed us in wars that have created havoc around the world. I remember the Iraq invasion, the invasion of the Willie. I think there are 185 media outlets from the Murdoch Empire, and only one in New Guinea had an editorial position against the invasion. And what a disaster that was. And that's the dilemma. That's the dilemma when you have so much power concentrated in so few hands. Those of you who thinks that the virtual platforms and social media have now levelled out the playing field, think again. The Australian wasn't set up by the Murdoch, Mr. Murdoch, to actually make a buck, because it doesn't make a buck. It was set up to influence political opinion. It was set up to subvert the democratic process. And nothing highlights this more than the Fox News empire, the spin-off of the same ideological claptrap, which has been proven to be totally unfit for human consumption. Totally unfit. All you've got to do, and I suggest you get a free copy because they can't sell the shit. They got to give it away, especially if they're in an airport. Have a look at it. Have a look at the editorial agenda. Have a look at the so-called analysis. Have a look at the ideas they promote. And think about the damage that has been created in this country by allowing such a small section of society to have such an extraordinary influence. And you think I'm talking, through, my anal orifice. This is not something that I just talk about. This is something that people who've been prime ministers talk about. In order to achieve government in this country, because of the extraordinary monopoly they have on creating social and cultural and political agendas, you need to get on your hands and knees and kowtow before the Murdoch Empire before you have any chance of getting into power. And if you get some exceptionally mildly reformist government like the Albanese-led ALP, the reaction is just extraordinary. So think about it. Celebrating? I'm not celebrating. I'm mourning. I'm mourning the independence of media in this country. I mourn every day. And every day I see more concentration of power and wealth in fewer and fewer and fewer hands, and I see the direct impact it has on this country. For example, good old Rexy, the new airline. Now, let's look at this little disaster, because it is a disaster. Because obviously in this country, we have what I called an ideological allergy. we have an ideological allergy to creating publicly owned, publicly managed essential infrastructure. What we've done over the last 50 years as a consequence of the organisations like the Murdoch media, what we've done over the last 50 years, we have privatised everything that doesn't move. Now, why do you think that public institutions were created? They were created for one very good reason. They were created because to allow the private sector to manage essential infrastructure is the pathway to the economic madness we are experiencing today. It is total madness. Here we have a situation where this country's national airliner, Qantas, and most countries around the world have publicly funded national airlines, because a national airlines, especially in an island nation, is critical to our independence, was privatised. Not only did we privatise the national airline, but courtesy of the Howard government, we also privatised the airports. That's right. And we were told that if we privatise the airports and the national airline, that'll all be hunky-dory. You'd all get cheap flights. There'd be competition. How do you have competition in a duopoly? Huh? Well, it's almost a monopoly in this country. A private monopoly, which gets government handouts. Qantas gets $2 billion during the COVID pandemic. Doesn't pay $1 back. Qantas illegally sacks its employees to save a quid. We see these private airlines outsourcing their work staff in order to save a buck, increase return for shareholders and their CEOs. I'm sure Mr. Joyce is enjoying himself in Ireland these days with his little $25 million package. What a joke. We privatise the airports, we privatise the airline, and then we expect a little player like Rex, which comes into, the equation and does a few flights between the capital cities, as well as being the only regional airline available. What do we see? It goes bankrupt. It's put into the hands of receivers. We see people kind of milling around because the plane they were going to take today is not taking off. And why? Because what we've done by privatising essential services, what we have done is we've created duopolies. Think about it. Today there is a shortage of critical pharmaceutical supplies and medications. And I'm quite well aware of it, being involved in the medical game, Quite well aware of it. We're even talking about a shortage of intravenous fluids, which is an essential component of any modern healthcare facility. People having to discuss limits because of shortages. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, we found ourselves in a situation where we rapidly realised there weren't enough gloves. There weren't enough essential services. And why has this occurred? Because of globalisation. No wonder Mr. Trump is doing so well in the polls in the US of A. Irrespective of what you think of Mr. Trump, the fact is that their globalisation strategy that has been pursued and so-called free trade strategy, it's never benefited the majority of people. It's only benefited a shrinking minority. But unfortunately, we believe the propaganda that it's the other's fault. The person wearing a funny hat, the person speaking a different language, the person of a different sexual orientation, the person comes from a different country. It's always somebody else's fault. It's never the fault of the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communications. Never their fault. Just ludicrous. You privatise production of electricity and gas. What happens? You get to a situation, although we're the second biggest gas exporter in the world, because of contracts that have been signed by Labor and Liberal governments in the past, there's not enough gas for the east coast of Australia. Everybody talks about energy prices and the fact that we need to move from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And we've seen the billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars, which have been poured into the renewable energy industry by governments, which is the private sector. But does anybody talk about building or rebuilding a new, publicly owned, publicly managed energy system to provide essential infrastructure? No. This is allergy. We have an ideological allergy to publicly owned essential services. We are quite happy as a people, and I blame myself and you and everybody else in this country for allowing this to happen, because we believed the bullshit that public is bad, private is good. And you know why public is bad and private is good? It's very simple. Because not enough resources are put into the public sector. Not enough resources are put into public education. Not enough resources are put into public health. Not enough resources are put into publicly owned roads. So automatically people think, oh, public is bad because it's second rate, private is good. Let's support privatisation. Let's be good boys and girls. Let's put up our hands and jump up and down with glee every time, the Australian tells us we need to privatise something else. And what happens? You pay more energy prices. You have bankrupt airlines. You saw the privatisation of the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory by Mr. Keating in the 1990s, and the fact that when the pandemic came, we were found with our pants down. What a ridiculous philosophy, ideology to follow, because somehow we think that if we've got enough money in our bank accounts at the end of the day, or enough resort, or enough, we bought things, that somehow we've got some type of security. Security doesn't come from accumulating wealth. Security comes from living in a society where you know that because you are part of that society, you are entitled to decide on how we create that wealth and how we distribute that wealth. It doesn't come from the individual accumulation of wealth. It comes from mutual aid. It comes from collectivism. It doesn't come from unbridled competition, because unbridled competition brings us to the situation we find ourselves in today. Now, just in case you think the rich and infamous are different to you and me, that somehow God, shines on their parade, well, I'm going to tell you two little things that will make you laugh, because we need to laugh occasionally. Because, you see, they're human beings. They're like kings and queens. They're human beings. They shit, they piss, they fall over, they have family disputes like the rest of us. They're human beings. Now, young Rupert, I think he's 92, 93, has decided to take his kiddies, well, 4 of his kiddies, who were part of a non-binding or part of a binding trust to the Nevada courts. You see, old Rupert made a big mistake regarding his kiddies. He thought they'd all be like him, you know? They'd all be like him. They'd all have the same ideas, and they would keep the family business going. But unfortunately, young Rupert's four eldest kiddies have ideas of their own. One of them, young Lachlan, is following his father's footsteps, but the others seem to have ideas of their own. But they're part of a binding trust, which means they're each entitled to a quarter of the Murdoch fortune. Now, Mr. Murdoch is very concerned, being 92 or 93, that God she'll call him up one day, like the rest of us, because they're mere mortals like the rest of us. And so he's going to court. He's going to court to try to break the binding trust which was established to ensure that his oldest children had an equal claim to the fortune, so that Lachlan can get it all, or control of it. Maybe not the fortune, but control, because he'd like the usual shit. And it is, look, I've got to apologise. Shit is useful. The usual, I can't use the word garbage. Who knows what? The usual delusional, that's right, the usual delusional thoughts which spew out of most, not all, but most of his media outlets, plus virtual and legacy. So he'd like us to continue the fight against the climate. He'd like us to stop fighting against the climate emergency because it doesn't exist. He'd like us to support more authoritarian rulers in so-called parliamentary democracies because somehow they'll look after his economic interests. He wants us to fight against each other so he won't turn our attention to people like him who have created the situation to a significant degree we find ourselves in today. So every time you step across or around somebody begging in the streets, every time you hear another program or comment about somebody sleeping rough or somebody not having enough to eat or somebody not being paid properly or somebody being exploited in this country, think about the reasons this is occurring and the significant impact the Murdoch media has had in creating the cultural, social, political framework which allows these things to occur in one of the richest countries on planet Earth. Listen to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano. I'm hosting today's program. Let's move on. The Olympics. Yep, it's Olympic times. Look, I remember when I was a little kiddie, which was a long time ago, in good old Bjelke-Petersen's Queensland, in, I think it was primary school, that's right. We used to have athletics and swimming carnivals. Different schools would come together and we'd have athletics and swimming carnivals. And at the end of the day, there'd be a victor. And the victor was not based on the number of firsts, seconds and thirds that your school got. But the victor was based, the overall victor, not the individual, but the overall school which won, was actually based on the number of students in that school and the number of firsts, seconds and thirds that school got. And what that meant is sometimes tiny little schools in the middle of nowhere with 50 kids or 30 kids would actually win the athletic competition because in terms of proportions, the number of first, seconds and thirds they achieved was related to the number of students, okay? Let's go to the Olympics 2024. Now, we get very excited. We get very, very excited when we win gold, silver and bronze. And I'm sure the individual athletes have done a marvellous job. I mean, most of them have not got a financial return. It's cost them money to go to the Olympics, not just to go there, but to do all the training, which can take decades, as we see. Minimal public support, unless you're Gina Reinhardt, and I'll talk about that in a minute. That's another little joke we can play around with. So in the Olympics, you've got minnows and sharks, okay? Because if any of you watched the opening ceremony of the little boats going down the Seine, the River Seine, you notice that some countries may have had 10 or 15 people and other countries had hundreds of people. So instead of having a medal tally, wouldn't it be nice at the end of the Games to actually proclaim that some minnow, little sovereign nation state in the middle of nowhere with, 50,000, 100,000, 1 million people, was the top of the table? Be nice, wouldn't it? A little bit more equality. I mean, what's the point? What's the point, really? I mean, an individual win is an individual win, and congratulations to these people. Some have more support than others. But actually, putting country against country, the Olympics was never designed for that. It was about the individual participation. And the fact now that the Olympics, there's so much professionalism in inverted commas, people getting paid big bucks, to throw things or run or jump or swim, it really undermines the ultimate sense of occasion. So, just a thought to throw into the debate. All right, let's move on. Gaza, the carnage continues. All right. Guess what? Our beloved Prime Minister, Mr. Dutton, is... No, I made a big mistake there, didn't I? Our beloved Prime Minister in waiting, Mr. Dutton, is currently in Israel, genuflexing all over the place, trying to, be a good lad, supporting the Israeli cause. Now, you see, media bias comes in many ways. It comes in many ways. Media bias. And it's interesting, but it's tragic at the same time. Now, the children that were killed in the bombing of the Golan Heights were Druze. That's a little Islamic sect outside the mainstream, Shia Sunni division, and they're mainly based in Lebanon. So what are they doing in the Golan Heights? Well, the Golan Heights is their traditional home because the Golan Heights is occupied territory by the Israeli government. It's a little bit like Gaza and the West Bank. It is, and East Jerusalem. It is occupied territory. So when Netanyahu went to the Golan Heights to get a little bit of political advantage because of the death of these children at the hands of the missile strikes from southern Lebanon, he was booed. He was called a murderer. He was told to piss off. Because none of this should have happened. It's happened because of the occupation of Golan Heights over the last 40 to 50 years, which has now been incorporated into the Israeli state to such an extent that the original inhabitants have been pushed aside, as we see in the West Bank and Gaza, and lands being allocated to Israeli settlers. Think about it. Then in the same day, we heard about 30 children being killed in a bombing raid on Gaza on a primary school. And the world shrugged its shoulders. The excuse was, well, we think that Hamas was hiding weapons in the primary school. Is that an excuse to kill 30 children? We see the same situation in Beirut. How long will this go on? How long will we, as a people, accept the indiscriminate slaughter which is occurring in Gaza and other parts of Israel? And it gets even more convoluted. Yesterday, the Israeli citizens attacked a military base in Israel, and Israeli Defence Forces had to divert tanks and troops to this base. And you know why? This base is a centre of torture. And under increased international pressure, the Israeli armed forces sent in military police to arrest some alleged perpetrators of rape and torture. So what happens? The Israeli public in that area attacks the base, stops those soldiers who have been alleged to be involved in torture from being taken away and interrogated. What an extraordinary situation we see in the state of Israel. What an extraordinary situation where many of the atrocities which have been committed historically against Jewish people are now being committed by the Israeli Defence Forces with public support from a section of the Israeli society, not the whole of Israeli society, but that section of Israeli society which thinks that they are beyond civilised behaviour. And the best way to address the Palestinian problem is to drive out Palestinians in the region between the river and the sea. And that's what we're seeing. 40,000 dead. Mostly children, old people, women. And it goes on. It's not just the 40,000 dead. It's the so-called collateral damage to society which has no functioning health system, no way of getting medications, with truckloads outside the borders of Gaza waiting to get in. You see, this doesn't occur on the 7th of October when 1,200 Palestinians were murdered, by Hamas militants in southern Israel, and hostages were taken. It didn't begin then. This began 75 years ago. And the fact is, if the Israeli state and the Israeli people and the Israeli Defence Forces, with support from the West, and I keep highlighting, it wasn't the Palestinians who massacred the Jews during the Holocaust. The Holocaust was a Western phenomenon, but it's the Palestinians who are expected to pay the price. And the carnage continues. Everybody's waiting for the big United States election before they'll make up their minds whether there will be a ceasefire or not. Okay, let's move on. Look, I could talk about this ad nauseum. All you've got to do is use your brain about what's happening. Look at the pictures. Make up your own mind. Is what we expect in the 21st century? Could you imagine the outcry in the West if the Russian military forces occupied Kiev, which is about double the size of Gaza, and kill 40,000 Ukrainians in this most brutal fashion? Could you imagine the outcry? But it's because it's Palestinians. We shrug our shoulders. Don't look there. Don't think about it. Move on. There's the Olympics. There's rugby league. There's the AFL. There's this, there's that. There's God. You name it. As I said last week, if there's one person I feel sorry for, it's God. We're all killing each other in the name of God. How ridiculous. It's really not the name of God. It's about our own power and wealth. All right. Identity politics. It's extraordinary, isn't it? Here we find ourselves as a people in what's called a tough situation, okay? Now, obviously, it's those with the least that have been asked to pay the most in order to put the capitalist system back on, an even keel with increase in interest rates. It's those with the least pay the most. Because, you see, during the COVID pandemic and during the last year or two since the COVID pandemic, you see, those with power and wealth have continued to accumulate wealth. Never seen so many corporate profits, have we? But again, it's those with the least who need the basic necessities who are asked to pay the most. But now there's a problem. It's the middle classes. Those nice people like you and me who worked for a lifetime, paid our taxes, obeyed the law, kept our nose clean. We are now being asked to pay the price for the private investment, for private profit mob to accumulate ever-increasing profits. Me, increasing rents, increasing mortgages, increasing costs for the kiddies, increasing government charges, increasing energy prices. And we go, oh, whoa, we need the Liberal National Party back in power. What a joke. What a joke. See, this is the trouble with Australian society. History started this morning when I woke up. Everything that's happened before is irrelevant. That's the type of attitude that leads us to the situation we find ourselves in. That's why I have such a strong interest in history, because history is an indicator of where we're going to go, what we're going to do, how we're going to respond. And if we wait for somebody else to do it on our behalf, it's not going to happen, is it? You look at every major political, social, cultural advance in the world today. Did it come from begging and beseeching? Did it come from kowtowing? Did it come from doffing your hat? Did it come from respecting authority? No. It came from resistance. Every major political, cultural and social change has occurred because of people like you and me. People who are written out of history, forgotten, even when a particular battle is won. We're forgotten. We don't count. We don't matter. As long as we pay our taxes and obey the law, it's hunky-dory. But once we start to protest, once we start resisting, once we start demanding a little bit better, well, then things get a little bit out of hand. The state begins to respond. Because, you see, we've got a difficult situation in Australia today, and it's very simple. Our representatives, those we elect to make decisions for us for the next 3 to 4 year periods, are frightened. But they're not frightened of you and me because there's no power of recalling parliamentarians in between elections in this country. I mean, once they're elected, they're there for 3 to 4 years. What they're frightened about is the Murdochs of the world. What they're frightened about is those people who control the means of communication in this country, whether it's a legacy platform or a virtual platform or a combination of each, because they know they have such overwhelming power to influence that if they step out of the box in any way, they may not be re-elected. But they're not worried about us because we just say, more please, not more porridge, but more punishment. Because that's the dilemma today. People think that if you press a button on the internet and you like something, that somehow life is going to change. Well, it doesn't change. The virtual world is the virtual world. It may influence opinions and create, social movements, but it doesn't change. Things don't change. Things change only when people come out on the streets and say enough is enough. And we haven't reached that stage in Australia today because we still think that somehow that those we've elected into power actually have the power to fundamentally change things. Look, I could change things tomorrow, I could do a Trump. He says I could do a phone call and I could stop the war in the Ukraine. Okay? Well, I'm going to do a Trump now. I can solve every problem, well, not every problem, but most of the problems which are tied to economic inequality in this country today. Well, it'll take a few years, but I could do it. Very simple. Now, we have around 26 million people living on a continent. I keep talking about this every week. Not a lot of people. Now, the great thing about living on the Australian continent, which we obviously stole from this country's First Nations people without reparations, well, the great thing about living on a continent is there's a lot of things happening on a continent. And especially a continent the size of Australia, there's a lot of natural resources which the world wants. Whether it's the new kind of lithium, bonanza, whether it's coal, whether it's gas, whether it's iron ore, whether it's bauxite, whether it's gold, whether it's silver. I could go on and on and on and on and on. Uranium too. We have natural resources coming out of our anal orifice in this country. But unlike the Norwegians, who are a bit smarter than us, I think, what we've done is we've said, well, why don't we give away the right to mine these natural resources to these private corporations who will then employ 2% of us and give us a little bit back in royalties and taxation revenue. But we will allow them to keep the majority of the profits. And then we wonder why public is bad, why there's not enough money for public health, why there's not enough money for public infrastructure, why there's not enough money for public education, why there isn't enough money to have a national publicly owned carrier, or a publicly owned Commonwealth Serum Laboratory, which we had, or a publicly owned telecom, which we had. All right? Or publicly owned airports, which we had. Or publicly owned harbours, ports, which we had. Wow, it's simple, isn't it? Even an idiot like me, with a limited neuronal capacity, because I don't believe in the private investment for private profit mantra, so obviously I must be stupid, because that's the only way, isn't it? Well, even an idiot like me knows that if these resources were owned by the people of this country, which theoretically they are, because it's the Commonwealth of Australia, that somehow we could solve most of the economic issues which face us today, like having enough aged care beds, like having enough resources to look after, to have a decent social security benefit, or having, more importantly, maybe some type of economic system, a wage for everybody. Oh, but no, we need the Gina Reinhardts to make a buck, don't we? Poor old Gina. I did mention her before. She's got a problem, It's not what you think it is or what I think it is. There's a portrait of Gina in the National Gallery and she's not happy with the way she's been depicted by this artist. Renegade, I think he's an Indigenous person. Renegade. and she's been conducting a campaign to have the portrait removed from the National Gallery. But you see, Gina, unlike the Pratts, doesn't give money to the cultural, icons of this country. So there's no pressure about removing money because there's no money there. But she's been getting her mates in the swimming fraternity to write little letters, and all her mates' little letters demanding that this horrible portrait of Gina be removed from the National Gallery in Canberra. Now, look, I want you all to visit the National Gallery in Canberra and have a look at this ugly portrait and tell me whether it is an ugly portrait or not. But what a ridiculous situation. Rupert takes his kids to court because he wants to give one of them privileges. Gina's up unhappy about a portrait in the National Gallery. Oh, come on, give me a break. But getting back to what I'm saying. So, if we nationalised, and it happens, you can nationalise this country's natural resources and the profits. We got rid of the middle people, the corporations which mine, develop them on our behalf, then just maybe, all the so-called economic problems we have in Australia today, the inequalities which have occurred, the exploitation which occurs, would disappear or be greatly reduced, and we'd be able to tackle the issues which we need to tackle in this country. We don't need 32,000 registered charities to bridge the gaps which exist in this country. What we need is the nationalisation of this country's mineral resources and the profits which are derived through this nationalisation to be distributed amongst all of us. For example, although in Iraq, with the original invasion of the Willing, their natural resources, their oil resources, were given to the private sector, the Iraqi government has renationalised their resources, and half of the Iraqi population depends on these nationalised oil facilities to survive and prosper. But and look at the Norwegians. They go to a private company and say, yeah, you can develop this. We get 90% of the profits. We'll put them in a trust for future generations, future trust. You get a profit, we get a profit, and we're happy. But no, here we say, well, I tell you what, we've got all these beautiful natural resources. Why don't we give them away to the private sector? And if we're really, 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 really lucky, we'll get some royalties. And maybe we'll employ 2% of the Australian population. And maybe we'll get some tax revenue. What a wonderful world we live in. Apologies to poor old Louis Armstrong. You've been listening to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. If you're interested in these ideas, I encourage you to join public interest before corporate interest. You can do that by going to the website pipsy.net. Remember, without your participation, nothing will happen. I can talk till the cows come home, and I have noticed that the sacred cows have come back into the studio. But the fact is that talk is cheap, all right? Talk is cheap. That's why I've been talking here for over 47 years. So, get involved. If you're not interested in the stuff we're talking about, there are other stuff that's occurring around Australia. Get involved. Get off your virtual platform. Get off your derriere. Yes, I thought I'd use French because of the Olympics. Get off your derriere and get involved. Whether you're involved in stuff I'm involved in or stuff you'd like, other stuff, it doesn't matter. It's that direct participation and direct action which comes from that direct participation which changes the political, social and cultural agenda which is, which is set by organisations like the Murdoch media and other duopolies which occur in this country. Thank you for listening to the Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano. You can leave pleasant messages on 0439 395 489. I do respond to letters. I love letters. Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. You can email me at anarchistage@yahoo.com or pibsy or info@pibsy.net. YouTube channels, public interest before corporate interest, josephtoscano.com. I could go on and on with all this media bullshit, Facebook page, Joseph Toscano. But the thing is, it doesn't matter what I say. What matters is how you respond to the situation that you find yourself in. Don't leave it to somebody else. You do it. Thank you once again. Listen to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station next week.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World this week. Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to The Anarchist World this week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
Public transport's great.
What's not great is that unless you've got a radio with you, you can't listen to 3CR when you're on it.
Until now. The Community Radio Plus app lets you listen to us wherever you are.
Get on board and search Community Radio Plus wherever you get your apps.
Time's on my mind when I had you by my side. Am I thinking loud? Do I want you around?
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.